Thank you all for coming down. This is going to be a two-part introduction. Actually, I'll give you a short background about Herman, and then Jane Nodell is going to welcome Herman on behalf of the city and the economics department and the Legacy Project. I've known Herman for quite a few years now, since we were both on the faculty at LSU, starting in 1980, I think it was. And we've worked together on several projects, including founding the Society for Ecological Economics and the journal Ecological Economics. And he's one of the few economists that I know that really has taken on board and actually led the effort to integrate the natural sciences and the social sciences. He wrote a paper back in 1968 called Economics as a Life Science, which was very influential in my thinking, and I think a lot of other people. And since then, he's elaborated on those ideas in many ways. He got his PhD from Vanderbilt, working with Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, and was at LSU for many years until 1988, I believe it was, when he moved to the World Bank, and stayed there as long as he could possibly stand it. Although I think he did have some influence on the bank and their procedures, didn't welcome the message that he was giving them at the time. And finally he was convinced to come to the University of Maryland, where he still is, where we were together for a while. And with that, well, let me just have a few reminders about the questioning process for those of you who haven't been coming to the seminar series. There'll be slips of paper passed around, and if you would write your questions on those papers, and we'll collect them at the end of the talk, and then we have a panel of 3 student inquisitors who will synthesize the questions and ask them to Professor Daly. And they'll be combined with some questions that students have asked based on readings that Herman has sent over the internet. And also let me remind the people in the class that we'll be meeting all together as a group this coming Thursday at the usual time in Aiken 104, just to catch up and see where we are with our various projects. I should also say that the class is doing a project this semester calculating the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare for Burlington, Chittenden County, and the state of Vermont, and this is an indicator that Herman and colleagues developed back in the late 80s, so we might mention a little bit more about that. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane Nodell, the chair of the Economics Department here at the University of Vermont, and City Commissioner, Council Commissioner, and also the chair of the Legacy Project.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's been wonderful to have Bob Costanza and his colleagues from the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics at the University of Vermont. It has really ramped up our thinking and our efforts in the area of sustainable economics, not only at the university but also in the city. And on behalf of the Legacy Project, I want to really express our appreciation for the research that the students in a seminar on ecological economics are doing this semester for us, and we look forward to getting together with you soon to hear about the progress. Anyone that's working on that project, could you just stand up or raise your hand? Great. Thank you very much. The Burlington Legacy Project, let me just say a few words about what that is. It is an effort, a broad-based effort. It brings together local government, local businesses, nonprofits, neighborhood activists, low-income advocates to move forward a long-term, a 30-year plan in which we make progress on 4 fronts in an interrelated and integrated fashion. And those 4 fronts are economic development, equity, environmental quality, and education. And I encourage you to keep your eyes open for announcements about public meetings, because we really rely on the public to guide us in our plan as we move forward. And so it's going to be wonderful to have Professor Daly here to talk about the sustainable scale of the economy, and for us in the Burlington Legacy Project to learn about the concept of uneconomic growth, a new concept for an economist, and to help us avoid uneconomic growth here in the city of Burlington. Welcome, Professor Daly. We look forward to your comments.
Well, I hope, can you hear me all right? Good. Pardon? It's close. In order to get in the right mood for my remarks, I think we'll have to assume maybe we're a few years in the future in the United States. There's been a regime change, and at the national level, now we have the Burlington City Council is in control. And so in that context, these remarks would not seem nearly so far out as they might seem at the current moment. So just project forward. Let's all be hopeful things will get better. This is my first time at the University of Vermont campus, and I'm very pleased to be here because I've been recommending students call and say, where should I go to study economics or ecological economics and get the two together and so forth. And I've been recommending University of Vermont, and I think a worthy recommendation for sure. You've become kind of the premier place in that area, and now I'll at least have a little firsthand knowledge to go along with that recommendation. What I'd like to talk about are really three, my remarks are kind of in three stages. First, a look at the main features of ecological economics, how it differs from standard economics, some of the friendly debates and differences between the parent discipline and the rebellious child. Second, a look at the meaning of economic growth, and as Professor Nodell said, uneconomic growth, the meaning of wealth and the opposite ilth, a term coined by John Ruskin, which I think needs to be introduced into the lexicon. And then thirdly, a few speculations about policy implications. Don't know if I'll get to the third, but I'll just keep going and then stop when time's up, and then questions can start. But on the subject of ecological economics in general and compared to neoclassical economics, I think the most important thing is the difference in overall vision. But let me work into that. Ecological economics is really about three main issues: allocation of resources, distribution of income and wealth, and the scale of the whole macroeconomy relative to the enveloping and containing and sustaining ecosystem, especially the third. A good allocation is one that is efficient in the sense of Pareto optimal, which I'll talk about in a minute. A good distribution of income or wealth is just or fair. In what sense? Well, at least in the sense of a limited degree of acceptable inequality. Not that everyone should be equal, but there should be some range of acceptable inequality beyond which there's no real reason for it. And third, the scale should be at least ecologically sustainable. That is, it could last for a long time. Nothing lasts forever, so we won't worry about that, but 500,000 years is very different from 50 years, so that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. And when I say ecologically sustainable, the words sustainable and sustainability has been applied to just about everything. People talk about sustainable politics, sustainable growth, sustainable everything. This is environmentally sustainable, biophysically sustainable. So we're talking about a biophysical concept of sustainability. Now, allocation and distribution, as you know from having taken economics, many of you, are very familiar concepts from standard economics. And for any given distribution of income, there is a different efficient allocation of resources with a correspondingly different set of optimal prices. That's the Pareto efficient allocation, and that means it is an allocation in which it is impossible to reallocate resources in any way that would make someone better off without at the same time making somebody else worse off. So that's a very weak concept of efficiency. I mean, it makes somebody better, but nobody can be worse off. Well, standard economics focuses primarily then on this allocation issue. It does pay secondary attention to distribution. I mean, logically it has to, because an efficient allocation is only defined on the basis of some given distribution, so it's forced to pay some attention to distribution. But they go beyond that. Many do, because distribution is interesting in its own right as a question of fairness and social justice, so many economists do take an interest in that. It's fair to say, however, that ecological economists consider the issue of distribution a whole lot more pressing, I think, than do most neoclassical economists, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute. This third issue of scale, here again, it's the physical size of the economy relative to the containing ecosystem. This is not recognized in standard neoclassical economics. There is no concept of that type of scale. You may talk about economies of scale, but there's always a scale at the firm level, not the aggregate scale of the whole macroeconomy. That concept is absent. And therefore, this idea of scale has then become the differentiating focus of ecological economics. Well, then the pre-analytic vision of the economy, of the ecological economist, is that the economy is an open system that is finite, non-growing, and materially closed. It's an open subsystem of a larger system, namely the ecosystem, and the larger system is finite, non-growing, materially closed, open with respect to solar energy. So if that's your basic image or vision of the nature of the economy, it's a subsystem within a bigger system, then immediately that suggests, I think, three analytical questions right off the bat. Number one, how big is the subsystem relative to the total system? How big is it? How big can it be before it overwhelms the larger system and kills it? And thirdly, the economic question, how big should it be? What would be the optimal scale of the subsystem relative to the total system? So I think those are fundamental questions that ecological economics seeks to address. You will not find those questions raised in standard economics textbooks. And so I think that's important. That's a big gap, and it's the gap that ecological economics is trying to fill. Now, if the economy just grew into the void, into empty space, then it would not encroach on anything. It wouldn't displace anything. There would be no opportunity cost to the expansion of the economy if it were expanding into empty space. But of course, being a subsystem of a larger ecosystem, the economy does not expand into empty space. It expands into the biosphere, and it does encroach upon other things. It does displace other things, and those other things are the opportunity costs, the sacrifices imposed by the expansion of the larger economy. And this gives us costs. This produces costs of economic growth, and these costs arise also from the fact that the physical economy is very much like an animal in that it is, we and all of our artifacts are dissipative structures, what the physicists call dissipative structures, things that tend to fall apart on their own and are only able to maintain their existence and structure by a metabolic flow from taking things in from the environment, raw materials, giving back waste to the environment, much as an animal lives off the environment through its digestive tract. The economy has a digestive tract, and we have to take account of it, not just a circulatory system. Well, this flow, metabolic flow, we call throughput. Not a very beautiful word, but engineers have coined it, and it seems to fit. Input equals output equals throughput, from all the way from depletion through production to pollution at the other end. And the depletion and pollution, of course, are costs. They're bads rather than goods. So not only does the growing economy encroach on the ecosystem spatially, but also it degrades it qualitatively, because the materials that it takes out are high quality, low entropy, useful matter and energy. The materials it throws back are degraded, high entropy, relatively dispersed and useless matter and energy. The scale of the economy has, I think, two measures. The throughput flow of resources needed to sustain that huge dissipative structure, and that consists both of the flow of goods and bads, annual production of goods and bads, and the accumulated stock in the form, one, of wealth, of goods, and secondarily the accumulation of bads, or ilth, as I've wanted to call it. Well, we would, of course, prefer not to produce bads or to have them accumulate into ilth. Now, why in the world do we do that? We don't want that. Well, we really have no choice, given that we're dissipative structures and that everything we produce, there's no alternative but to consume. And if we stop depleting, then we in our economy die of starvation. If we stop polluting, then we die of constipation. So take your pick. I think what we have to do, of course, is to keep the metabolic throughput within the natural capacity of the larger system to absorb waste and to regenerate them into useful raw materials which we can use again. Well, there are many different scales, many different sustainable scales of the economy. I guess just those of you who have studied forestry and many different sustainable yields of forestry and fishery, there are many different scales in which the economy could be sustained. You might say the optimal sustainable scale is that scale for which the difference between wealth and ilth, wealth minus ilth, is a maximum. So I think that's the idea behind sustainable scale, or optimal sustainable scale. And that would occur then, as economists will all say, when the marginal production of bads is equal to the marginal production of goods. And beyond that point, we get into this realm of uneconomic growth, which, again, to quote John Ruskin, would be uneconomic growth is the point beyond which GNP turns into what Ruskin called a gilded index of far-reaching ruin. I like that phrase, you know, that's a gilded index of far-reaching ruin. So be careful with it. It changes qualitatively at a certain point. Well, as economic growth then pushes us from an empty world into a full world, the limiting factor in production increasingly becomes natural capital, not man-made capital. That is to say, the fish catch today is not limited by the man-made capital of fishing boats, but it's limited by the remaining natural capital of fish in the sea. It used to be limited by fishing boats, not anymore. We've got lots of idle fishing boats. Won't do any good to make more. What we need is more fish in the sea. The two are complementary. Similarly, you might say that irrigated agriculture is today limited not by the man-made capital of pumps and pipes and sprinkling systems, but rather by the natural capital of aquifers and flow of rivers, which provide the basic fresh water for the irrigation. So when you get bored with my lecture as an assignment, you can think of other examples of that type, see how many you can think of, and we'll talk about them later. I think they're fairly plentiful. Well, as we move then from the empty world into the full world, economic logic remains the same. Well, what is the economic logic here? The economic logic says you should maximize productivity of the limiting factor. You should invest in the limiting factor and you should economize on the limiting factor, focus on the limiting factor. Economic logic stays the same, but the identity of the limiting factor switches out from under us. No longer man-made capital, more and more it's remaining natural capital. So we must economize and increase the productivity of remaining natural capital, invest in its replenishment. It doesn't do any good to invest in more fishing boats. Let's invest in fish in the sea. So that's been a big change, and we have not adapted to that. Certainly the World Bank has not adapted to that in its investment policies. And I think economists in general, we have all been rather slow to move in that direction. So it becomes more and more important as natural capital plays this limiting role that we have to study the nature of environmental goods and services and inquire deeply as to whether these goods and services are rival or non-rival, excludable or non-excludable, in order to know if they can fit within the market system of allocation, or if they require some other institutions of allocation supplementary to the market. Well, ecological economics then has no quarrel with the standard analysis of allocative efficiency, at least not very much of a quarrel, given a few conditions. 2, given prior social determination of the distribution and scale questions. So allocation, distribution, and scale, these things have a policy sequence that's important in ecological economics. Distribution, once something becomes scarce and it's no longer a free good, then the question is, who owns it? That has to be settled politically. There's a distributive question. Who will have ownership to this newly scarce asset? Actually, it's the scale question that when the scale hits a certain point, that means you have a newly scarce asset. Then the question is, who owns it? So first is scale, second distribution, and then thirdly becomes allocation, market, trading, and allocation. So the main difference then, although it's this focus on scale, secondarily, there's been an increase in the focus of ecological economists on distribution. And this because there are two elements of distribution that are very much neglected even when economists do pay attention to some part of distribution. And this is the question of intergenerational distribution. Distribution of ownership of the resource base between generations, among generations, is usually neglected. And the question of the distribution of places in the sun among all other species, in addition to human beings, biodiversity. So that comes in as a question of distribution as well. Distribution, you might say interspecies distribution as well as intergenerational distribution. Also, as more vital, as we have expansion of the scale, then more and more vital resources and natural services cease to be free goods, and so then they have to be allocated, usually by the market or some adaptation of market institutions. And then the question of the fairness of the basic distribution underlying that market and its efficiency becomes ever more important. So that's another reason why ecological economists pay so much attention to distribution. Well, within this overall context then, and this basic vision, let me mention a few somewhat more specific questions of difference in debate and discussion between ecological economists and neoclassical economists. These are questions which I think are currently being debated, topics which it seems to me would be areas for a really good term paper or a master's thesis or something if one of them tickles your fancy. First, the question, is it true? To what degree are natural and man-made capital primarily substitutes or complements? I mean, I've just assumed in my examples before that they're complementary. When goods are complementary or factors are complementary, the one in short supply is limiting. If they were good substitutes, then there wouldn't be no limiting factor. The absence of one would not limit the usefulness of the other if they were good substitutes. If they're complements, that's not the case. So it's very important then to really do that little assignment I mentioned, see how many examples fit this notion of complementarity and limiting factor. And so that's an empirical kind of study, and I think it would be an important one. A second area of difference has to do with the degree or tightness of coupling between the physical throughput and gross national product. When we increase gross national product, does that necessarily increase a huge throughput, you know, in a fairly tight relationship, not one-to-one, but fairly tight? Or is there a really loose relationship here and you can run GNP way up with hardly any increase in throughput? That's an area of considerable debate. We have, even within ecological economics, people don't agree on that one. I would characterize it, though, I would say that by and large in ecological economics, the idea is that the coupling between, physical coupling between throughput and GNP is fairly tight. Not one-to-one, but you're not going to run GNP way up on the same physical throughput. So that all the ideas of the information economy and dematerialization of GNP, or as I like to call it, the angelization of GNP, I think is not, you know, standard economists tend to think you can go a long way in that direction. Ecological economists rather doubt it. So that's another area of discussion. Going on from that, there's another coupling, the coupling between GNP and actual welfare, satisfaction of life. Is that coupling tight or loose? Do you have to, in order to get more welfare, do you have to increase GNP kind of one-to-one? Or is there a huge possibility for increasing welfare with GNP staying pretty much the same? Once again, here I think there's a big difference in view, in which I would say the neoclassical economist assumes that there's a pretty tight relationship between GNP and welfare. If you want more welfare, you're going to have to get more GNP. Fortunately, you don't need very much more throughput, but you do need a whole lot more GNP. Whereas the ecological economist says, no, you can get a whole lot more welfare with the same level of GNP. Welfare is not tightly coupled to GNP. So that's another area of debate and discussion. It has a fairly strong empirical base as well as, or at least it seems to be somewhat capable of empirical resolution. A deeper, perhaps more philosophical difference, which may not be so easily resolved empirically, is the relative importance in production of value added versus that to which value is added. So value added is one of these curious terms. It cries out for prepositions, you know. Value added by what, to what? What the hell are you talking about, value added? Well, it means value added to the throughput, the natural resource flow, by labor and capital. That's value added. So it's in this view, if we go back to Aristotle's terms, the distinction of causation between efficient cause and material cause and so forth. In Aristotle's terms, labor and capital are the efficient cause of production. They're the transforming agent. Whereas resources, natural resources, are the material cause of production. They are that which is being transformed by labor and capital into product. Now, neoclassical economists, it would seem, sometimes at least, do not believe in material causation because their production functions, you know, Q equals F of what? K and L, capital and labor. Well, where's resources? It's not in there, capital and labor. It's like saying that, you know, it's a recipe which tells you that you can get, you know, a chocolate cake from the inputs of a cook and her kitchen, and there's no ingredients are needed. So that's kind of strange. Once in a while, sometimes economists will include resources in the production function. They'll stick R in there between the parentheses. But they always do it in such a way that it violates the first law of thermodynamics. They'll say it's a multiply, we're going to multiply these things together, R times K times L. Well, when you multiply them together, what does that mean? That means you can reduce one of the factors as low as you want, as long as you increase one of the others. As long as you don't go all the way to zero, you can get awfully close. So you can make a 1,000-pound cake with 5 ounces of ingredients. That doesn't work. Well, this basic error in the theory of production is repeated with admirable logical consistency in national income accounting, where GNP is defined as the sum of all value added by labor and capital. No valuable contribution from nature is recognized. 0. Natural resources in the ground are of 0 value. Oh yes, when extracted, they're valued by the marginal cost of capital and labor needed to extract them. So they're not free, you know, when you get them above ground, but their value is simply the labor and capital that went into extracting them. Okay, yes, there's such a thing as royalties. If you're sitting on a nice oil well, you can get royalties, and that looks like it's a price of resources in the ground, a royalty payment, but the actual amount of the royalty payments are determined by the savings in capital and labor extraction costs from the richer deposit, which you're fortunately sitting on, compared to the marginal deposit, which they would have to use if they didn't have access to yours. So they'll pay you that premium based on how much labor and capital cost is being saved, not based upon some concept of value attributable to resources in the ground. So nature is just out of the picture. Everything comes from labor and capital. The royalties arise from the fact that all resources are free gifts of nature. But some free gifts are easier to unwrap than other free gifts. So you get a premium if your gift is easy to unwrap, and that's what you're getting paid for. On the other hand, ecological economics recognizes that there really is something, although I don't think we've done a very good job of really nailing this down, but that there is some contribution from nature that has to be accounted for independently of labor and capital. And that, we talk about it, basically say that this is the provision of low entropy matter energy. That's our ultimate resource, that's our ultimate means, and it's provided by nature. We are incapable of producing low entropy materials and energy in net terms. We are utterly dependent upon nature for that. And without that, we can't live, we can't make any of the things we need, and so forth. So this low entropy matter energy, our sources are becoming scarce and more so. So to omit this necessary contribution of nature from our general theory of production and from our accounting practices at the national level seems to me is a monumental error. I don't want to claim that ecological economists have done a really good job at all of correcting that error, but you know, we've recognized it and we're at least working on it and struggling with it. Well, those of you who are, I guess one question which is sure to be in the minds of many is, well, all this is very interesting about ecological economics, or maybe not, but how is that different from resource economics or environmental economics, which is taught, you know, in the standard curriculum? You can find courses and have for a long time resource economics, environmental economics. I think the difference is that these latter two, resource and environmental economics, are subfields of neoclassical economics. They do not consider scale to be an issue at all. They have no concept of throughput. and they're focused entirely on efficiency of allocation. In the case of resource economics, the focus is the efficiency of allocation of labor and capital in the extractive sector of the economy. Nothing, that's pretty much it. Well, let me say a good word about resource economics. They come up with some good things. They've developed the concepts of scarcity rent, user cost, hoteling's rule, all sorts of really good things. So don't want to be appreciative of the contribution of neoclassical economists at the same time that we're critical of some of the shortcomings. And then in the case of environmental economics, again, the focus there is on efficiency of allocation and the breakdown in efficiency that results from externalities of pollution. So contamination, pollution of the environment, external costs. This is viewed in the light not of scale or throughput, but of inefficiency in allocation. The correction then is to get taxes or prices, affect prices by means of taxes so as to internalize these external costs, or to change property rights through Coasian property, make sure that something is owned by everyone so that people defend the natural resource. Ecological economics, though, unifies these two things through the concept of throughput. Resource economics is unified with environmental economics through connecting the extraction and depletion side with the pollution environmental side through the metabolic flow, the throughput, which brings the things together into one view. Okay, let me switch gears a little bit to this other questions of scale and sustainability, moving just from the first to the idea of uneconomic growth and sustainability a little more. Economic growth, I suppose, is the major goal of all nations today. I can't think of any other goal which nations would more unanimously say is their number one priority than economic growth. So that makes it really important to know what is economic growth. What are you really talking about? Usually we say, well, economic growth is growth in GNP or GDP, which is almost the same. So I don't know whether exactly what are we talking about. Is GDP some sort of is it a holy icon of the summum bonum, or is GDP a kind of statistically graven image of mammon? I think it's got elements of both, and it can do a qualitative flip somewhere at some point. So let me consider two meanings then of economic growth. Economic growth in sense one, simply the expansion, the physical growth of what we call the economy. That is production and consumption of goods and services. The economy is basically the human niche in the overall ecosystem. And it's measured either by the stock of people and artifacts or by the flow necessary to maintain them, either of those. As either of those measures get bigger, then we have growth in the economy, which we quite logically call economic growth. It makes sense. If your dog gets bigger, you call that dog growth. If the economy gets bigger, it's economic growth. And it's a legitimate use of the English language. The second meaning of economic growth, sense two, is any change in the economy for which the extra benefits are greater than the extra costs. So that's a very different meaning. Benefits and costs are not physical concepts. Benefits and costs refer to psychic experiences or of the enjoyment of life, the increased or decreased enjoyment of life. And that can result from physical change, or it can result from non-physical alterations in the economy. So whatever profits us, whatever benefits us, whatever yields net benefits is, in this sense, economic growth. And in public discourse, we shift very easily from one meaning of economic growth to the other meaning of economic growth, back again, and these two things are totally, totally different, because quantitative increase in size is one thing, qualitative improvement in something is a completely different idea, and conflating these two things together, as we do in GNP, is really a recipe for disaster. Well, I think we could then go on to talk about the meaning of growth, sense one or sense two of growth, as it relates to each of the questions: allocation, distribution, and scale. I'll try to be really brief on that subject. Certainly, as you increase scale, that is economic growth in sense one, just expansion. Is that also economic growth in sense two, net benefit? Might be, doesn't have to be. And so that's I guess the most important of the cases. Net benefit can certainly result from improvement in allocative efficiency. We can have the same scale and just allocate things better and be better off, and that legitimately can be called economic growth in the second sense of net benefit. On the question of redistribution or distribution, if we redistribute wealth or income, can that lead to growth in either sense? Well, in sense one, it doesn't increase scale because you're just redistributing the total, so that's not going to be growth in sense one. Also, in sense two, can redistribution lead to an improvement in net benefit? Well, it can't lead to a optimum because you're taking away from somebody and giving to somebody else, so the economists would rule it out as an increase in efficiency. You can't get any efficiency increase from redistribution. But, Pareto was not God, and many people think it's pretty sensible to imagine that if you take resources away from very low marginal utility uses of the rich and devote it to high marginal utility uses of the poor, that legitimately can be thought of as an increase in social efficiency without increasing scale. So if the rich person is feeding chantilly cream to his overweight cat, and you tax him $1 and you reduce the cat a little bit and you redistribute that $1 to the poor person feeding milk to the baby, that looks to me like that's probably an improvement in social welfare, although the economists would rule that out because it violates the Pareto criterion. Well, I'm sure I can argue that it's quite possible, given these two senses of growth, to have scale expansion, which is economic growth in sense one, growth of the economy, but uneconomic growth in sense two. It's not increasing net benefits, it's diminishing net benefits. It's increasing ilth rather than wealth. Well, a legitimate question then would be, what makes you think that? How do you know that's the case? What evidence? There is empirical evidence, and people have mentioned the issue of the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare and other attempts to measure in this way do give an indication that maybe we have crossed this inflection point beyond which GNP becomes not a measure of net benefit, but a measure of net ilth, a gilded index of far-reaching ruin. But I think, and I've been involved in those empirical measures, I support them, I'm glad people are doing them. At the same time, though, I think there's a kind of a simpler argument to be made in these grounds. I mean, we already know that if the scale of the economy is increasing, and that's the sense of growth we're talking about, then what happens as we expand the scale of the economy? Well, presumably as rational beings, we satisfy our most pressing wants first. So when we expand into the economy, take more resources, we'll devote them to wants that we consider really important. and then secondarily to less and less important. So that gives us the law of diminishing marginal utility or marginal benefit. At the same time, you would expect that rational critters would expand into their environment in such a way that we sacrifice the least important environmental services first, so that we don't sacrifice a vital environmental services ahead of a trivial one. Well, that's maybe not so true. I mean, we're only learning that the environment is scarce, and so that is something we perhaps do not do very well. But let me give us credit for learning. Suppose we learn how to do that. Then that gives us a law of increasing marginal cost of expansion into the environment. So with increasing marginal costs, declining marginal benefits, there comes a point where they're equal. The optimal scale, growth beyond that point is uneconomic and so should cease. Well, that I think is, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, while it's important to measure these things, there's a qualitative argument which, in a sense, makes the measurement a little bit redundant. If you jump out of an airplane, what you really need is a parachute, not an altimeter. So once your parachute's opened and you're floating down where you can look at your altimeter, okay, that's fine. But I think we should first go for the parachute. Well, that leads me then to my concluding remarks on a little bit about policy, or speculations about policy, namely, parachutes. What are some reasonable parachutes that we might look for? But first, to get into that, let me ask you to imagine a thought experiment. Imagine an economy in which all prices are correct, just as the neoclassical economists would want them to be, and the scale of this economy is fairly small. It's small enough so that the correct price of air and water are zero. They're still free goods, but that's their correct price, zero for a free good. And we know we're living at that scale. Then, time goes, the population triples, per capita consumption triples. We have a 9-fold increase in scale. Now air, water are scarce, but let's assume that they have a positive price, but economists and institutions have exactly figured out the proper price for air and water now that it's a scarce good. So prices are right once again. We have a Pareto optimal allocation of resources in the first case and in the second case. The neoclassical economist is happy, he's indifferent, but what about the average citizen? Or citizens indifferent between these two scales? Let me give you just two examples of two citizens who have had rather opposite views about, some are going to like the smaller scale and some are going to like the larger scale. And here's, on the side of the smaller scale, let me quote a little short paragraph from John Stuart Mill, thinking about this kind of issue. He said, "It is not good for a man to be kept perforce at all times in the presence of his species, nor is there much satisfaction in contemplating a world with nothing left to the spontaneous activity of nature. With every rood of land brought into cultivation, every flowery waste or natural pasture plowed up, all quadrupeds or birds which are not domesticated for man's use, exterminated as his rivals for food, and every hedgerow or superfluous tree rooted out, and scarcely a place where a wild shrub or flower could grow without being eradicated in the name of improved agriculture." That's Mill's vision. He would rather have a smaller scale in which there's more environment left to the spontaneous activity of nature. To bring Mill up to date, probably we only need to add that from the point to the predicament of the little wildflower, the predicament now of traditional agricultural crops, which are themselves in danger of being eradicated by their genetically engineered cousins, which grow faster and are more resistant not only to pests but also to pesticides. Well, the other view, contrary to Mill, would be someone like Julian Simon or Peter Huber, who wrote a book a while back on the same subject. He would probably consider Mill very old-fashioned, and Peter Huber's view of scale, perhaps the optimal scale, is rather different from Mill's. Quote, Huber says, "Cut down the last redwood for chopsticks, harpoon the last blue whale for sushi, and the additional mouths fed will nourish additional human brains, which will soon invent ways to replace blubber with olestra and pine with plastic. Humanity can survive just fine in a planet-covering crypt of concrete and computers. There is not the slightest scientific reason to suppose that such a world must collapse under its own weight, or that it will be any less stable than the one which we now inhabit." Well, in fairness to Huber, he does admit that such a world might not be as pretty, but on balance, it's pretty clear that he likes it better than the other one. So, I think neither of these two individuals, or the sides or the attitudes which they represent, will be much comforted by the neoclassical economists pointing out that in both cases, the right prices give us a Pareto optimal allocation. There's something very important that's been left out of this right price Pareto optimal allocation. That's the whole issue of scale. And again, that's why it's such a central feature in ecological economics. Let me just make one or two more points in closing. I think well, this is one reaction to the scale question. There's a somewhat contradictory reaction among neoclassical economists because, after all, they haven't thought about this very much. And that is that the scale question is automatically solved along with the allocation question. That prices determine the optimal scale along with the optimal allocation. Now, regarding this second view, I think it's rather inconsistent for neoclassicals to claim that the same set of prices that optimizes allocation would also optimize scale. That would sin against the mathematical rule that you cannot maximize simultaneously for two different variables, two independent variables. And it would also sin against the policy rule of economist Jan Tinbergen, who said that for every independent policy goal, we need an independent policy instrument. So if prices are going to be the instrument of allocation, then it's hard to see how they can solve independently the problem of scale. Well, the way out of this, I think, that neoclassical economists take, the logical escape route, is to claim that the allocation problem and the scale problem are reducible to the same problem. Why? Because scale is total. There is no separate, scale is everything. The economy is not a subsystem of a larger ecosystem. Rather, the economy is coextensive with everything. It embraces the whole ecological system. Everything in the economy, everything is economy, nothing is environment. Everything in creation, every whale, every amoeba, every copper atom is conceptually harnessed or yoked to pull the human wagon. And their services are allocated according to economic optimality to pecuniary calculation of present value maximization, puts every amoeba in his place and every whale in his place. There is nothing that is external. There is only economy. I think this is a kind of a result. This, logically, I think this is kind of a legitimate escape act, you know, but its consequence then is that everything becomes economy, and it's the carrying to extremes of the valid principle of internalization carried to a far extreme. Well, one of the saving graces of neoclassical economists, one of the reasons that everybody loves them, is that is there humility when faced with the information requirements of a centrally planned economy? At least that's one time where the economist is really humble. When you put up and say, well, what about central planning? No, we can't do that. Information problems overwhelm us. That's why the Soviet Union collapsed, et cetera. And you know, for good argument, good reasons. But the information requirements for centrally planning the entire biosphere, even with liberal use of markets, is so utopian that honest neoclassicals surely blush at the very thought. So, well, another way to make the point is to distinguish price determining from price determined policy actions. Allocation then is price determined. Distribution and scale are, or should be, price determining. So what then determines the distribution and scale? Well, social values of justice and sustainability, not exchange value, not prices. So that the values, the dimension of value which is relevant to an optimal distribution or an optimal scale is not the same dimension of value by which we determine optimal allocation. Allocation is governed by exchange value, by the ratio of marginal utilities measured by prices in individualistic trading in the market, so forth. Distribution is a question of justice, social justice, not individualistic decisions, but political, collective, social decisions, and likewise for scale, collective decisions on scale having to do with other dimensions of justice, intergenerational, interspecies, and so forth. Well, so we cannot then use allocative, even corrective allocative prices to calculate the cost and benefit of a change in scale or distribution, because we first had to set the distribution and the scale in order to get the prices that we later use for calculation. So I think that would be circular. On the question I think this distribution issue regarding interspecies distribution, or what I've referred to as, I think it's important here that setting the scale, unless the interspecies distribution is the same thing as the question of biodiversity. How much of the places in the sun do we guard, do we keep back for other species? If we're not willing to limit the scale of the overall human economy, then the whole idea of biodiversity and preserving biodiversity is an empty slogan. And this is a point I'd really like to raise with my ecologist colleagues. Many of them recognize it, some I think don't. It really doesn't do much good to talk about preserving biodiversity unless we are willing to limit the scale of the human economy. There's an inverse relationship there. Well, in conclusion then, I guess I have one other policy prescription or implication that comes out of this scale and discussion. Usually most of our environmental policies are aimed directly at efficiency. Let's go for efficiency, go for the low-hanging fruit, win-win situations. We don't initially go for frugality. That is, we don't limit the quantity of the throughput. We instead say, let's use the throughput more efficiently. Well, that sounds like a good idea, and I'm certainly not against efficiency. But the problem is with the sequencing. It's with what comes first and what comes second. If you go first for efficiency, what happens? Efficiency, having more efficient automobiles is equivalent to discovering more oil. It's like having a greater supply of the resource if you use it more efficiently. And the consequence then, immediately, is a fall in the price of the resource. A fall in the price of the resource means that we find more uses for it. So we use more. We become less frugal. You know, we're more efficient, but we're less frugal because we allow the total throughput to increase. Efficiency buys more use. If we turn it around and do the other way, if we say frugality first, we limit the throughput, then that will induce efficiency as a secondary consequence because we will have to be more efficient in the use of a smaller amount of resource. And so we get efficiency as a secondary benefit if we go first for frugality. So I would say one general implication for policy purposes is let's go first for frugality limits and then let the market induce the corresponding efficiency increases. Instead, we go first for efficiency increases precisely to avoid the political problems of reduced frugality, but still I think that would be a better way of doing it. Well, I think in conclusion then, that neoclassical economics, for all of its many virtues, some of which I've mentioned, tends to strain out the gnat of allocative inefficiency while swallowing the twin camels of unjust distribution and unsustainable scale. And needs to reallocate some of its own intellectual resources towards these questions, these more important questions of distribution and scale. And I think in order to do that, the concepts of uneconomic growth and ilth and unsustainable scale need to be incorporated much more in economic theory. We need to be able to pick up an economics text and thumb through the index and find the concept of ilth, uneconomic growth, and all of these things discussed, along with wealth and goods. So those I think are the things that ecological economics is trying to do. Still got a long way to go, but I think this is a bit of an outline of the effort of ecological economists. Thanks for your attention.